Yes, welcome everybody. This is pretty exciting webinar because this is the launch of our next phase of learning. Really, here we've got our core geniuses, Beth and Jenna, and this webinar is a product of a merge of two different things that came forth through this process of the past, let's say since last November, when we started the high performance camp through until now. And we wanted to address those, and in talking about it, it led to a deep dive into more research because we work with such professional people that wanted to be able to give you information and give you answers. And through that research, we've come up with ways that we think can help all of you who are super high level and super educated at this point really make your training more focused, more deliberate, with even a deeper understanding of what you're doing and why you're doing it to get to whatever your goal is for yourself. I hope that's the right summary, Jenna and Beth. And so the way it started was this. The two prongs that came together and led to the research dive. And honestly, it's a really big credit to Jenna, who was doing all sorts of investigative work, and then Beth, who came in there with support and had reached out to other people like Tracy, a huge, enormous contribution from Galena as well, always consulting with Galena. We had meetings with Lana, we had meetings with Brooke, with Natasha Kazitsky, all of the people who work on elite level planning tried to come together and work on this. And the first part was this. We had received, Jenna specifically, Beth, me, we had received from a few athletes and a few coaches this same concern, and that is doing all of this going to make my muscles big or bulky, which seemed to be a concern. And that was at the center of what we wanted to talk about, so that people could dispel some myths about, because if you stop doing things for a concern that's maybe not actually true, you're perhaps preventing yourself from getting to where you want to go. So that was the first thing. The second thing was something that I had brought up actually with Galena following the FIG Academy when we were talking about things, and that was my observation of how I see a lot of people, and this is not specific to the national team or to level 9, 10 or whatever, sitting in oversplits. And it led me to ask the question, is this even useful for anything, the way I see some athletes sitting in oversplits? And then we started having a conversation, well, what is even the point of oversplits? So those types of things led us into a much bigger realm of what are we doing and why we're doing it, and do the athletes and coaches truly understand it? And we felt after the November high performance camp, we had gotten a lot deeper into understanding. And actually after the pandemic and quarantine and the work that people did, we've gone even deeper in the understanding. So this is now then, well, now what? We've spent so much time developing strength, and some people, and everyone's at their own stage of that, but then are we kind of done? Are we just, this is what we got our strength and now we're sort of done with that? Or is there another place that we go? So I'm gonna pass it to Jenna, but before doing that, we're gonna use our technology function here just for the fun of it. Did anybody here on this call, this meeting, have the chance to read the two things I sent out as previews? One was an article and one was a 13-minute video on ballet techniques. So there's a function where you can raise your hand. Do people see that? If you had a chance to look at those, can you just let me know? It will help me. This is amazing. Good. Oh, this is really very good. I'm so happy that people had a chance to read those things. If you didn't have a chance to read it before this meeting and watch it, I want to really encourage you to do so, because they're very meaningful and very relevant to what Jenna and Beth are going to talk about today. And I'm going to loop back to them at the end. But I will refer first to the article, the actual textual article about why the dance team stopped stretching. And that is sort of going to lead us into the topics we're going to talk about today. So Jenna, our guide, our research extraordinaire, take it away.
Okay, good morning, everyone. First, I want to draw your attention through the Zoom functions of the chat and the Q&A. So throughout the presentation, if you have any questions, please feel free to use either one. Beth is going to be monitoring those for me, and she will flag me and stop me as needed for any amount of clarification, questions, anything like that, because we will be covering a good amount of information today. So I'm going to share my screen and make sure that you're able to see the presentation. I think sometimes you might need to switch between speaker versus gallery view, but I'm sure all of you have that all figured out by now with the amount of time we're all spending on Zoom. So let's get started. So the pathway to maximum amplitude, phase 1 and 2 of strength and length. So we'll start by, this is our high performance team. I think you all know all of us by now, but we're always looking at research, at different ideas, at evidence-based ways to help you be able to reach your goals. Unfortunately, there's still limited published research specific to rhythmic gymnastics, but there's a good amount of dance-based research that is applicable to dancers and applicable to rhythmic gymnasts, as oftentimes you both have similar concerns and similar goals. Today, we're going to look at dispelling some myths that are held pretty common throughout rhythmic gymnastics and throughout the population. But so some of those are no pain, no gain. It worked for me, so it will work for you. We're always looking at the evidence, looking at the research, because just because it worked for someone and they did this specific stretch or exercise and they were able to become wonderful rhythmic gymnasts, doesn't mean that's what's best for everyone. The myth of you can only become really flexible when you're young and you just keep losing it the older you get. And also that strength equals bulkiness. By using research-based interventions, you'll be able to continue to progress and improve as gymnasts and as coaches and decrease your risk of injury to help you reach your maximum potential, both as gymnasts and as coaches. So our objectives for today, we're going to review the general topics that we covered in phase 1. Hopefully you'll be able to understand the components that make up available or passive range of motion, identify ways to improve available passive range of motion, define the differences between available passive range of motion and accessible, also known as active range of motion, recognize that strength throughout the available range allows a gymnast to improve their accessible range, thereby reaching your maximum amplitude, and gain a basic understanding of these concepts to better understand the upcoming body part specific lectures. Today, we're going to spend a lot of time learning some more of the anatomy and physiology behind everything and talking in more general terms. The upcoming lectures will be applying that to body part specific techniques, body part specific interventions, but we need today to learn the basics and learn some of the terminology that we'll be using in the upcoming lectures. Upcoming webinars. So phase 1, reviewing what has already been taught and already been implemented. This includes education that's been presented at camps, camps that you've been to throughout the years, including the high performance camp, including some of the Zoom work that we've done together during this time of home training. Phase 1 included different movement screens, corrective exercises, an emphasis on dance and ballet technique. And moving into phase 2 does not mean leaving phase 1 behind, because the basics are always important, and the basics and continuing to work on the basics allow for continued forward progress, continued work into phase 2 and reaching your maximum amplitude.
Jenna?
Yes.
Can I jump in there and just tell everybody that we created that concept of phase 1 and phase 2 in our discussion. So when we talked about how do we move forward, we almost said to ourselves, well, what's phase 2 of all of the strength conditioning that we've been doing? So we categorize those as phase 1, which is everything we've done so far, and then phase 2, which is what's next. Those are our created concepts for the purpose of our program.
That was just a way to kind of keep us organized and kind of help orient you on what we've already covered and what we're moving into. So let's start by a review of phase one, a review of what we've already covered. So topics include flexibility, strength and stability, cardiovascular endurance, and active recovery. So in phase one, our flexibility, we focused on symmetry and square position. So we've talked a lot from the beginning on the importance of a square split, and that this is your foundation to be able to move forward into more difficult elements, which allow then for more difficult body difficulties, apparatus difficulties, all of that, because you're in that square and symmetrical position. And that you need to spend the same amount of time working on your flexibility on both sides and training it deliberately. Your balance and symmetry, developing strength and flexibility equal on both sides. So it shouldn't be, well, I work on my dominant side, on my good side, and then, oh yeah, I guess I should do a couple on the other side. We've always said you should train both sides with the same intensity, the same deliberate training, the same focus, because that symmetry allows for improved strength on both sides and decreased risk of injury because we're developing both sides equally. In strength and stability, we've also already looked at muscle activation patterns, that by allowing the right muscles to activate at the right time, it's going to improve joint stability, how your joints and bones are able to move, how they need to work together, and it also allows for pain-free movement. Things that we've talked about is using your glutes to initiate movement instead of your low back. So when you're going into penché, you're not just dropping into your lumbar spine, dropping into your low back. You're actually lifting up, using your glutes to extend that hip before you lever into your low back, instead of just relying on excessive movement through your low back. Even if you can get to that same position by using the right muscle activation patterns, it's going to allow for decreased risk of injury, as well as improved consistency of performance. If you're using the right muscles, you'll be able to get to that position consistently and with strength each time. During phase one, we looked at exercises to help build a solid foundation, to work on your core strength, that TA or transverse abdominis, pulling that belly button towards your spine, lifting up out of your pelvis, working on shoulder blade or scapular strength, because how your arm attaches to your body is how your shoulder blade attaches to your ribs. And with the code of points continuing to emphasize higher tosses, faster movements, more walkovers, you need that scapular strength to allow for stronger movements, consistency of your tosses, and the ability to really reach your maximum potential, your maximum difficulty score consistently. We looked at ballet technique, things like using your turnout from your hips. So not turning out and then wiggling your way into a bigger turnout, but really you're rotating through your knees and dropping down through your arches, but finding that turnout coming from your hips. Using your plie effectively. For those of you who watched the video that Caroline sent out, that was all about the plie as the foundation of all movements. Your plie is needed for turns, for balances, for your leaps. And in the video, they talked about finding the connection between your plie, your releve, and your jump. And that plie is really the foundation of everything. It's how you get in and out of your skills, how you move safely, effectively, and with grace. Yes, Caroline.
Jenna, I just want everyone on this webinar to understand, Jenna and I did not speak about this beforehand, but in my notes, the sentence I wrote down from that video was, ballet technique is the pathway between plie, releve, and jumping. And exactly what you just said, that is the core of every single movement that you do in rhythmic gymnastics, that pathway, plie, releve, and jumping. That video is an ode to the plie as the base of absolutely everything. And therefore, understanding how to do all of this stuff that Jenna is mentioning in this slide at the most basic level is the pathway to every movement you're trying to do successfully. So, so excited that you just talked about that pathway. And I really want to encourage gymnasts and coaches to watch that video to understand why the plie matters, and why the correct technique matters of the plie. it's the base of everything, and we see all kinds of plie without the heels down, incorrect positions. And if that's the base of every movement we do, then that's the thing we really got to get right. So I cannot emphasize it enough. And cheers, Jenna, that we lifted the same sentence.
So that ballet technique that you worked on in November with Christina, that you're hopefully continuing to work on with your home training, ballet technique is your strength and conditioning, right? This is how proper ballet technique, proper ballet movement patterns with your turnout, your plie, pulling up, emphasizing that deliberate training in ballet is what will allow for, again, the theme of consistent maximum amplitude performance with a decreased risk of injury. We've also gone into your cardiovascular endurance. So rhythmic gymnastics can be classified as a high intensity intermittent exercise. Individuals, your routines are 1 minute 30, group 2 minutes 30 seconds. We're not running a marathon, you're not running a 5K. So running or that type of cardiovascular endurance doesn't really have carryover into rhythmic gymnastics. What the research has also shown is that training only your routines also doesn't effectively stress your cardiovascular system, and that the best way to improve your endurance is through the HIIT programs, high intensity interval training. We want to continue to improve your endurance so that the energy you have at the beginning of your routine equals the energy you have at the end of your routine. And it's not that downward slope where the last 30 seconds you're really struggling because your cardiovascular endurance isn't where it needs to be, because that fatigue that you might feel near the end of your routine limits your performance. A well-developed aerobic system, or that cardiovascular endurance, also helps with your total energy availability and helps with faster recovery. So in some competitions where you're having to compete all 4 apparatus in one day, you need to be able to recover quickly between each routine. Or for example, in event finals where you might have a quick turnaround between one final and the next, you need that faster recovery, and that comes from training, from the HIIT training that you're doing during training, both off season and during season. Fatigue, Caroline, did you have something? Okay, sorry.
No, at the end of this, I want to jump in because this is so incredibly important.
Okay. Fatigue also has a large impact on technique and injury risk. So the better your cardiovascular endurance is, the better your performance is, the higher scores you're going to be able to achieve and decrease your risk of injury because you're not tired as you're training and as you're competing.
I just want to emphasize how crucial this is, and again to thank Jenna and Beth, because all of the HIIT programming was developed because a coach came to us several years ago and said, we spent the summer doing running and I see no impact on improved endurance for routines. And it led to all of this. And I think what Jenna is saying here, that also training routines is not the only way to improve that. It's really, really important for everybody to understand, because of exactly what Jenna said. First of all, we often see mistakes in the last 20 seconds of the routine and when people are starting to fatigue, so that helps with that. And the explanation about finals that are back-to-back or long-term competitions or a mixture of both. This type of work is going to be what gets it done, not 700 routines, not jogging, this. So for the people that perhaps think, yeah, but I'm going to do what I think, I'm going to keep running, or the coaches who maybe think that was the way to do it, it might have been the way to do it way back when, but the whole point of all this research is that this is actually what the research says right now, and this is good for gymnasts, and it is very difficult on the system, and it shows results incredibly well. So I also want to thank them for bringing this to us, and also to thank coaches, because the kinds of questions that coaches and gymnasts are asking of Beth and Jenna and Christina and Amanda and Galina and this sport performance team, they do bring it back to each other. They do discuss it, and they do research it to bring back solutions that I that are effective. So anyway, Jenna, it's just so good.
We always love when gymnasts and coaches ask us questions that challenge us to learn more, challenge us to go back to the research and find the best ways to provide you those evidence-based resources to continue to progress. It challenges us. We love being nerdy with it and having those conversations to be able to develop the programming to help rhythmic gymnastics continue to move forward. We also in phase 1 covered active recovery, taking the time to take care of your bodies. This includes active cool down, active soft tissue release with foam rolling, and mid-practice recharge, so that not only are you taking the time to recover so that the next training session you're ready to go, but even with those mid-practice recharge, doing some stretching sequences, some movement flows will allow you to feel more energized and ready for even just your next routine during practice. But taking the time to take care of yourself is so important so that each day can be as efficient and effective as possible. And this is just that handout that you guys already have, but just a reminder that active recovery, although today we're talking about physical programming, it also includes your proper nutrition and hydration and your psychological active recovery. So we've covered kind of everything a brief overview of what we've already covered in phase 1. So now let's move into the new information, progressing into phase 2. So phase 2, we're continuing to progress towards your maximum amplitude. So how do we use the square symmetrical flexibility that you gained in phase 1 and translate that into your maximum amplitude? How do we use the foundational strength that you built with the phase 1 exercises to reach your maximum amplitude? To learn how to continue working towards maximum amplitude, we really need to look a little more into the anatomy and physiology. And the knowledge of this will help you to understand the relationship between phase 1 and phase 2, allowing gymnasts and coaches to reach that maximum amplitude with decreased risk of injury. But I can't stress enough that you cannot move into phase 2 without phase 1. Without it, you'll see you might be able to get to the right position, let's say in a balance, but you might be inconsistent with it, where sometimes you get there and sometimes you don't. But that's because you need that phase 1, that foundational strength and stability to be able to find consistency of performance, to decrease your risk of injury, both injuries right now, but also down the line, that if you keep doing elements, if you keep going into these positions without the foundational strength to get there, it can lead to future injury. It can also lead to burnout from the sport, where you start losing your joy in gymnastics, both from injury or frustration of inconsistency. And so we really want to emphasize that just because we're starting to talk about phase 2, you still need to do phase 1. And it's not just, oh, well, I've already done it, so now I can move forward. Phase 1 and the foundational strength, foundational square splits, some of those basic exercises that we've covered will always be needed to maintain your foundation and continue to progress forward.
Jenna, would you mind just telling everybody in this meeting what physiology actually means? Just we have a whole range of people, but that's sort of a term that maybe a younger junior hasn't studied yet.
Yeah, so anatomy, we're talking about your bones, your muscles, your joints, things like that. Physiology is more of the internal workings of the body. So how your body works together from like a cellular and chemical level. So today we're going to be doing a lot more with anatomy, but just know that there's other aspects that work together kind of behind the scenes that are a little bit harder to visualize or harder to understand. So we'll talk a little bit, but the focus will really be on learning a little bit more about anatomy, because I think when you can visualize how your body works together and kind of see your bones and your joints and your muscles, it allows you to have that better understanding of why we're doing what we're doing. So phase 2, flexibility. So flexibility is defined as an individual's ability to move a joint through the entire range of motion without undue stress to the involved musculotendinous unit. Musculotendinous unit is just a fancy way of saying your muscles and how they attach via tendons to your bones, how your muscles attach through your body. We're going to talk about your available, also known as your passive range of motion, and your accessible or active range of motion. And what you can see in this picture here, which is from one of the research articles that I pulled some information from, and hopefully you can all see my mouse moving here. This picture A, this passive range of motion, she's holding her leg here. So she's holding it with her hand. She's still using her muscles a bit, but she's really holding it in that position with her arm. When she lets go of her leg, you can see how far down it drops into this position, her active position. So while she has this much range available to her, she can only access this amount of range. Passively, she can hold it here, but actively, she can only access this much range, which doesn't reach her maximum amplitude, her maximum available range of motion. And so we're going to talk about both available or passive range of motion and your accessible active range of motion, and how we need to address both of those and how they work together to reach your maximum amplitude.
So Jenna, is it fair to say that their passive or their available range is what they are able to, what they should be able to do, right? Or what they have within them? Which,
yes.
Oops, are you there?
Yeah, I'm here.
I lost my screen. Their available range is what they have in them naturally. Is that right?
Naturally, but also that they've worked towards, because we'll also talk today and in the upcoming lectures that you can increase your available passive range of motion as well.
Okay, so their available range is what they currently have as a max.
Yes.
But their accessible range, or what they can actually show, is their active or their accessible.
Yes.
So, and so one of our real objectives is for these two pictures here to look the same.
Yes, absolutely.
Just want to clarify for everyone on this, in this meeting and in this country, that this is our goal. If you're talking about your personal maximum, that's everything. But in the particular realm of amplitude, whatever you're able to do in these gorgeous, amazing stretches that or positions that look different when you try to do it unassisted, right, Jenna?
Yes.
Try to merge those into one and to know how to get to that point. So I just think this is so awesome. This picture is completely perfect. But so that all the gymnasts understand, available is what you can do, accessible is what you can show. Would you say that's fair?
Absolutely, yes.
I'm so jazzed and I love it. All right.
Okay, so we'll start first by talking about your available or passive range of motion. So that's how far you can passively, with no or limited muscle activation, move a body segment. So in that previous picture, she was holding her leg there with her hand. So she was passively or with minimal muscle activation holding her leg there. We're going to get into the anatomy now. So your available or passive range of motion can be broken down into different things that make it up. So your available range depends on your anatomical structure, your joint mobility, your muscle length or flexibility, and your neural mobility. So first we're getting into the anatomical structure. Your anatomical structure is pretty much based on genetics and development, so minimal changes can occur here. But if you don't recognize the limitations in your anatomical structure and you put too much pressure on it, this can and likely will lead to injury. So in this picture over here, this is a front view. So this is your lumbar spine, your low back, and then it goes down into your sacrum, that triangle shaped bone at the bottom, and each side of your pelvis comes off of that. What we're going to talk about right here is your hip joint. So in this picture here, this is your femur, your thigh bone that comes down from your hip, and it has what's called the head of your femur, which is that ball-shaped position, that ball-shaped part of your bone here, and it sits inside what's called your acetabulum or your hip socket. So your hip joint is what's called a ball and socket joint. And so that ball kind of moves in that socket as your femur moves front to back, as you go out and in, as you rotate into turnout and into neutral. That's how your joint works, that ball and socket position here. And it's your anatomical structure. So this is where we're going to get a little bit more technical. So please ask any questions throughout if you want me to repeat it or anything like that. But so this picture here, we're looking at your leg from a top-down view. So this is looking from the top. So this is your socket here and that ball and socket here, your femur, and then your foot is below. So it's like if you cut through your pelvis and you looked straight down towards your toes. One thing that makes up your anatomical structure is we have the ball, the head of your femur here, and then it comes into what's called the neck of your femur, and then that attaches into the shaft or the part that comes down into your thigh. There's an angle that's formed by the head and neck of your femur that's called, and so in normal, what they find in the average person is what's called normal anteversion, or 15 degrees. So if we come straight from out here, we're going 15 degrees forward, and that's what's considered normal in the average person. And you can see there's these red dots here. So we have a red dot in the center of the ball and in the center of the socket. And the hip wants to line up those two dots for the most stability, the most comfortable position. We're going to go down to picture number C here, and this is what's called retroversion. So in picture A, it's that 15 degrees. Well, now there's 5 degrees. So it's actually moved back a little bit. And what you can see here is now that dot, the center of the ball, the center of the head of your femur, is behind the center of the socket. So what your body naturally wants to do is center those, so you'll actually turn out a little bit. And in a person with a more retroversion, what you might see is in a relaxed position, their feet are actually in a little bit of turnout. Their whole legs kind of fall into that turnout. And so some gymnasts might have a little bit of retroversion. But what happens if it goes the opposite way? Into picture B, you have what's called excessive anteversion. So normal was 15 degrees. Now let's say you have 35 degrees, where now that angle of the head and neck of the femur has come forward. So now that dot, that central portion of the head of the femur, of that ball, is in front of the central portion of the socket. When your body wants to find that neutral, most stable position and line up those two dots, it ends up looking like this. So because it had to rotate in, now you have the in-toeing position where your toes kind of turn in, because you're trying to center the ball on the socket to provide the most stable position that's most comfortable and safe feeling for the body. So if you have someone where when they're sitting, their toes kind of come in, it might be because they have excessive anteversion, and so that's just their anatomical structure. And really at that point, there's not a lot we can do about it. So they just might not be able to reach as much of a turned out position as someone who has normal anteversion or even a bit of retroversion. And if you keep forcing it, gymnasts want to succeed. They want to get to the position that you're telling them to get to. So you might see them kind of shimmy through their knees and feet, and they're trying to turn from different joints, putting stress on different parts of the body, which can lead to injury. One thing that can contribute to excessive anteversion is this position called W sitting. And a lot of times you'll see this in little kids, like before they're even walking, when they're just starting to sit up, that they'll find this W sitting position where their legs kind of form this W here. And that can put more stress through that neck of the femur and cause them to develop in more of an excessive anteversion position, which leads to that in-toeing position. The reason that kids tend to do this is because it's easier. They have a wider base of support, so they don't have to use their core muscles and their hip muscles as much, but it's important to discourage this position. So if you are working with really little kids at any point, kind of discouraging that W sitting position. But if someone has developed and they are in their hip formed in that excessive anteversion, there's not a lot that we can do about it besides just finding ways to maximize the turnout that they can get with the anatomical structure that they have. Something else that can contribute to that anatomical structure is how shallow or deep the acetabulum or that hip socket is. So in this picture here, it's showing a very shallow socket, okay? So the ball will shift around a little bit because it doesn't have as much support through the socket. Now, in someone that has a shallow acetabulum, a more shallow hip socket, you might see more range of motion, where they have a lot more ability to move their hips in different directions, both into internal rotation or in toeing and falling in, as well as external rotation or turnout. But what you need when you have that shallow hip socket is a lot more strength and stability to keep it safe so that that ball isn't moving around excessively and kind of grinding through those positions. You can also have a deep acetabulum where that hip socket is deeper, okay? And so now there's more coverage in that hip socket, and that can limit how much motion you have. So sometimes when you have those kids that just can't get their middle splits and they have that bad deep hip pain no matter how you try to stretch them, this could be the anatomical structure limiting their ability to get there. And so no matter how much you stretch in different ways, how much you push on them in middle splits, they're just not going to get there, and it's that deep pain, and so we can cause injury by continuing to push there. I think we have some questions.
Yes, Jenna, you have 2 questions. The first one is they just wanted to confirm, so it is not recommended in order to sit in the W position. Is that correct?
So especially for kids that are developing, for young children, you do not want them sitting in that position. It's preferred to be in what's called a ring sitting position, where the bottoms of your feet are together and your legs are kind of forming that ring, or you're kneeling, where your knees are actually tucked under you rather than going out into that W sitting position. Now, that's not to say that this is a bad position to spend a little bit of time stretching into, but you don't want to force this position. And for young developing kids, it's not a recommended position.
And then Jenna, I believe you actually answered the second question as well. The second question was, is it better to encourage kids to sit in butterfly position? And I believe that's what you just described as the ring position, correct?
Yeah, and so especially for little kids, they might not be in that kind of tight butterfly position where your heels are pulled in really close. They might be a little bit further out to give them a better base of support, but that is the preferred position over a W sitting position.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Okay, so yes, Carolyn.
Jenna, you're still going with this slide, so I'm probably going to wait maybe till the end. You're still going with this slide, right?
This slide I just finished on.
Okay, so as a general principle, we can look at this explanation that you've given and understand, you know what? This is just what my this is just how my anatomy is, and just not going to be able to get farther. Or we have the opposite approach, which is sometimes we don't actually care what your anatomy is. We're going to get farther. I guess I'd like to put out there what we are working towards is actually neither of those resolutions. We're working towards this is what I sort of have anatomically, but I am going to be able to maximize this entirely, even if I have some excessive anteversion. Is that the correct?
Yes.
And even if I have a shallow socket, is that right? I can still maximize what I have and possibly develop even more safely, despite what I've been given, which ultimately could put me in a better position than somebody with some retroversion and some deep sockets who has no base to show their anatomical structure, I mean, their anatomical configuration. Would you say that's right?
Yes. So really, the main portion of this slide is just there's certain things that we can't really change. It's just how your body has developed, but we can maximize what you have, which is exactly what you were just saying, I think, is that, and that's what I'm going to get into next, the next few slides are, what can we change? So we can't really change anatomical structure and how your body developed and some of the genetics behind it, but there are things that we can change and can address to work on that address the available or passive range of motion and maximizing that.
Exactly. So I'm joining here to put the exclamation point on how important that is, that we don't try to force something that's not there, but we also don't just sort of be like, that's it, that's all I got. We are going in the pathway of maximizing what we have. And again, tremendous slides. Just It's so good. I hope everybody out there is just drinking this in.
So while I don't expect you to remember and truly be able to identify someone that might have normal antiversion versus excessive antiversion versus retroversion, and where we might not be able to identify a shallow versus a deep acetabulum or hip socket, I just want you to get from this that certain things, and when we're stretching and not getting anywhere and it's that deep, bad pain, that's not a good idea to just keep pushing through it. And really at that point, you will cause injury versus allow for any improvement. So anatomical structure is kind of just what it is. But what we can look at is what's known as your joint mobility. So your joint mobility is your bone, your cartilage surface, your ligaments. Within your joint mobility, some change is possible, but really this should be assessed and addressed by a medical professional to ensure that we're addressing a decreased joint mobility to be able to improve it in a safe manner. So we're looking back at the hip again. This is the pelvis from the side, your acetabulum or your hip socket, and your femur and the head of your femur. Around that acetabulum is some cartilage that's called your labrum. And so the labrum is there to help your femur to stay centered where it needs to be and help keep it stable. But if we put too much pressure in different spots of that labrum, that cartilage of the labrum can tear, it can pinch, it can cause injury that can result in time out of the gym to let it heal, sometimes even requiring surgery. And so this is why improving joint mobility is best left to medical professionals to identify, is it a joint mobility issue, and how to safely improve the joint mobility. Another thing that I want to point out is the foot and ankle. So you can see from this picture, there are a lot of different little bones in the foot and ankle. And every spot that those bones meet up is a joint. And so in the past, we've talked about using your spine equally, right? Not hinging through your lumbar spine, through your low back, but really making the whole back work together to get into an arch position. Well, the same thing applies to the foot and ankle. If we overstress one part of the foot, that can cause injury there. And so you really want everything moving and working together. But increasing this should be addressed if you feel that you're kind of hitting a stopping point and you can't get further, or there's pain in a certain spot. This should be addressed with a physical therapist, with an athletic trainer, to be able to improve the joint mobility. I thought this was kind of cool. This is an x-ray of someone in releve. And so what we're looking at is you want each of those joints, how the spacing between each bone moves, to be pretty equal and not overstressing, let's say, the midfoot. So if you have more stress here because you're limited through this ankle joint here, that can cause stress fractures, stress reactions, sprains, strains, all sorts of injuries through that midfoot. And that's what we're trying to avoid. So joint mobility and increasing joint mobility should really be left to medical professionals. So what can we really work on in the gym? We can work on muscle length and flexibility. And so for this, we want to get a little bit into the research. The improvements in your flexibility that are seen within one session of stretching is likely due to what's called neuromuscular changes. So we're not actually lengthening a muscle during one session of stretching. And you say, well, when I stretch, I go from point A to point B, I get further. But that's not actually a change in muscle length. The research is a little variable, but most of the research agrees that a change in the actual length of a muscle can take 6 to 8 or even more weeks of consistent stretching to improve upon. But you do see improvements within one session of stretching and throughout 1 week, 2 weeks, and on. A lot of those changes are what are called neuromuscular changes. And what more current research is looking at is that when you're stretching, what's happening is there's a decreased threshold of what's called the stretch reflex. So housed within each muscle are little sensors called muscle spindles, and they sense the amount of stretch within the muscle. And it's their job to try to protect the muscle from overstretching or getting into a dangerous range, or going back to our deliberate training, avoiding the muscle going into the panic zone. Okay, so we want these muscle spindles are there to protect. But what can happen is if you're stretching and your muscle itself perceives that it's in danger or it's stretching too far, it's going to send a signal to the muscle to contract, to try to protect itself. So what happens is you're trying to stretch and lengthen the muscle, and the muscle spindle is telling the muscle, no, don't do that, contract. So it's a game of tug of war. Your muscle itself is trying to contract while you're trying to stretch it or lengthen, and you're not going to get anywhere. So this is where that no pain, no gain really is proved false. That if you're stretching into a painful range, you're not going to gain anything, and you will actually cause soreness, pain, even injury because of that. But by stretching in a range of a little discomfort, you'll be able to decrease the threshold of that stretch reflex kicking in, of those muscle spindles kicking in, so that you can go further before your muscle says, nope, don't go any further than that, it's dangerous. The other thing that the research shows is that as you're stretching and these neuromuscular changes are occurring, is there's an altered perception of sensation. So you don't feel it as much because you're stretching it, and so it improves your tolerance. But again, that only happens when you're stretching in a range of a little discomfort, a gentle pull, not stretching to your maximum range. Where a lot of gymnasts, it doesn't register as painful. It feels like a good, strong stretch. But the research shows that that stretching into that range really isn't beneficial, and you're better off backing off a little bit and just being really consistent with that stretching. So like I said, it's better to stretch in the range of discomfort, not pain. Your muscle spindles will cause that reactive tightening where they're trying to protect itself and not let you lengthen into that position, into that stretch. But this also means that because that muscle spindle is housed within your muscle, it's not talking to your brain and telling your brain to tighten your muscle. It's directly telling your muscle to tighten. So what this means is you cannot will your muscles to relax. And so if someone is stretching and you're like, just relax, or they're lifting your leg and you're saying, relax, keep breathing, you're going too far. And your muscle itself, no matter how much you say, okay, I'm gonna relax, keep breathing, relax, it's not gonna help, because that mechanism where your muscle spindle is saying, no, this is too far, tighten, is within the muscle, and it doesn't talk to the brain. And so you shouldn't feel sore after stretching. You should feel elongated and lengthened. And if you're feeling sore after stretching, or you have any pain after stretching, or you're stretching into that painful range, it's not an effective stretch, and it can lead to injury and isn't going to help you reach your goals. So the research is a little conflicting on how long it takes to lengthen muscles and what's happening, but what we're learning more of is these neuromuscular changes that's allowing for an increase in range of motion, in that passive range of motion or available range of motion as you're stretching.
So Jenna, like sucking it up and cringing and just having someone stretch you and be like, you know, you're getting more flexible as your athlete is sort of cringing or possibly crying. I understand that actually does nothing. Is that correct?
That is correct. And
okay, I hope that's clear for every single person on this call. That does nothing except possibly destroy your muscles. And we're here over the next 5 weeks to talk about the actual ways over that 6 to 8 week period where you can do this. Would you say that that's the fair way to say it?
And you'll see improvement in one session, and it'll be more effective by stretching in that range of discomfort and not pain. Because you say, oh, well, if I keep pulling, they keep getting further. But where's that range coming from? Gymnasts are really good at finding a way to get there, but it's not always the safest, most beneficial square position to get there. So it might seem like they're going further, but where is that range really coming from? Because they're trying to avoid that painful position, and they'll get really creative without even realizing it, maybe without you realizing it, that's how they're getting there.
And ultimately, Jenna, if you get there basically the wrong way, is it correct then that still doesn't help your accessible range?
Absolutely.
So there you go. Boom.
So we talked about muscle length and flexibility. Now we're going to get into what's called neural mobility. And so this is how your nerves work throughout your body. So your nerves start in your spinal cord, and then they weave their way kind of through a web of splitting into different smaller nerves down into your arms, down into your legs, and they work their way throughout your entire body. But what you can see here is everything is really interconnected. But the interesting thing is that nerves don't stretch or lengthen like muscles do, but they can limit your available or your passive range of motion. So we're going to look through some videos here. So this rubber band here, we're going to call this your muscle, right? It's elastic, it stretches, it contracts, it moves like almost like a rubber band does. But nerves, like I said, don't stretch and lengthen like that. Nerves are more like this string or rope, where I'm pulling on it, but it has kind of a tight end point and it doesn't stretch if I keep it, doesn't elongate elastic like an elastic rubber band like a muscle does. So what happens if you don't have enough length in your nerves? What can happen is now I'm pulling and my rubber band, my muscles can't stretch or lengthen here because that nerve gets to its endpoint. It gets to where there's tension in that nerve, in that string or rope, and that's what's limiting your motion. Your rubber band, your muscles can go further, but the nerve itself is what's limiting. So now,
this is mind-blowing, everybody. Now, this is just mind-blowing, and I'm joining again to put emphasis on how incredibly important this is, because I have personally learned so much during this sort of explanation that our teachers have given us. We really got to zone in on this, and we really have to understand this. You might have a rubber band. Your muscles might be able to go much farther, but you have this nerve and it's prohibiting that. So understanding the nerves is so important. And thank you all so much for including this in our study, because this is a key for us. So just flashing lights, everybody. Notepads, notes. I mean, this is really, really important. Thank you.
So in the upcoming lectures, we'll talk a little more specifically on how to lengthen a restricted nerve. But what happens now is if I have enough length in my nerves, well, now my muscle can stretch to that maximum amplitude, to that longer range, that length, because I have enough space in my neural mobility, in the length of my nerves, to be able to move without restriction. One example, though, that we'll cover right now is a pike stretch with toes pointed versus flexed. So this is one where growing up, I did not realize this, and coaches would say, okay, stretch in your pike stretch with toes pointed, now flex your feet and feel your hamstrings lengthen even more. Well, what you can see in this picture, so this is your skeleton here, and this is kind of a close-up of what we're looking at, is your hamstrings attached from your pelvis down just past your knees, and they stop right past your knees. So pelvis to knees, this is your hamstring. But now let's look at your nerves. They start from your spine and they work down the back of your leg. And look, those nerves split and go further past your knee, all the way down into your foot and ankle. So what if we're in a pike position? You'll see my little stick figure gymnast come up a little bit during this presentation. But so we have our rhythmic gymnast with her nice bun here, and she's sitting in her pike stretch with her toes pointed. Okay, so your hamstrings connect from your pelvis down to about here, down to your knees, and your toes are pointed. Now we're flexing your feet and you feel it stretch more. But has this distance between your pelvis and where your hamstrings start and where your hamstrings end, that distance hasn't changed if your toes are pointed or if your toes are flexed. What has changed is the tension or the pull throughout your nerves here, because now your nerves are having to lengthen all the way around the bottoms of your feet and into that flexed position. So we have more tension on that end part of the nerve than you do when your toes are pointed. So in that pike stretch, when you change the position of your toes from pointed to flexed, you're just adding neural tension and adding what's called a nerve glide, which is the best way to lengthen your nerves because they don't stretch like muscles do. So we want to be able to move between pointed and flexed positions. And as you keep pumping your ankles through those positions, it will decrease the tension and improve the neural mobility and allow you to stretch into different positions without restriction. So how do we improve or increase the available range of motion? So we're going to talk about how to improve your neural mobility. I just spoke about that a little bit. We'll go in a little more depth. Improve your flexibility, and identify and understand reactive guarding. So first, neural mobility. So before you even start to think about getting into oversplits, you first need to warm up your body. Most of you already are starting with body waves as part of your warm-up, but you might not know that this is also warming up your neural mobility. So as we discussed before, your nerves don't stretch and lengthen the same way that muscles do, but the nerves can limit your flexibility and limit that range of motion. Body waves help to glide your nerves from your spine up into your head and down to your fingers and toes, and this prepares your entire body to begin working through lengthened positions without restrictions. Those nerves need to move through the surrounding tissues without any restrictions, both in sliding and gliding between the surrounding tissues, as well as finding that length in those lengthened positions. So one thing that you can do is adding head nods and pointing and flexing your feet to your normal stretches. So if you're sitting in a pike stretch or you're sitting in a split, just by pointing and flexing your foot, you're changing the tension in that nerve and allowing that nerve glide to help you warm up. Even just by bringing your chin to your chest and looking up to the ceiling, adding that head nod, because your nerves all start in your spine and work their way down. By sitting in a split and bringing your chin down to your chest and looking up to the ceiling, that's also going to change the neural mobility, pulling from the other end, from that more central end of your spine. Increasing your available or passive range of motion by increasing your flexibility. So we want to be able to increase your range of motion through improving your muscle extensibility. While we might not actually be lengthening the muscles themselves, especially within shorter periods of time, the research, like I said, is still a little conflicting on how long it takes to really lengthen those muscles. But regardless of what's happening, the goal is always to improve the body's ability to achieve a larger range of motion. We do this with square stretching. So we're using the joints and muscles in proper alignment, because not only is this just safer and allows for a decreased risk of injury, it's also more aesthetically pleasing. Square positions just look better. And even though we're moving into phase 2 and discussing how to continue progressing, the basic principles of phase 1 are still extremely important. Without a square split, you're not going to be able to progress into higher difficulty and reach your maximum amplitude. So square stretching, for example, when the hip flexors are limited, you might be able to compensate by extending or arching through your low back, your lumbar spine. While this might look like you're stretching further, it's actually not improving your hip extension range of motion. And what it is doing is putting more pressure at your low back, increasing your risk of injury, such as stress fractures in your lumbar spine. You'll also have difficulty achieving a good position during your body difficulties because you're not using the right joints, the right muscles at the right time. Another example is if you stretch with your front leg turned in. So you can see she's in a split position, but that big toe is closer to the ground here and she's turned in. Well, now when she's in this position, her bottom leg is still turned in. It looks very similar to the position that she's stretching in. So when you're sitting in splits, when you're warming up, when you're stretching, you really need to be deliberate with it. You need to emphasize where your body should be, because that is going to directly translate to what your elements look like. Square stretching isn't only for the lower body. Square shoulder position is also really important. So some of you will do this where you're kind of stretching with the rope to increase your shoulders and kind of warm them up. But when it looks like this, where one shoulder comes back and then the other, we're not in a square shoulder position. So sometimes what you might need to do is lengthen that rope to work on both shoulders coming back equally at the same time, both to stretch the shoulders equally, because that's stretching through your shoulders, through your thoracic spine, or through your mid-back, and it's improving the muscle patterns of knowing that that square position is key. That square position is where you want to be. Along with flexibility, what the research shows is holding a static position, so staying in one position for greater than 30 seconds to 1 minute, does not improve the effectiveness of the stretch. So anytime after that 1 minute, when you're holding 2, 3, 4 minutes in a one position, let's say in a split, it's not increasing the effectiveness of that stretch. What's better to do is try to change positions a little bit. Now that doesn't mean, okay, I'm going to switch legs or I'm going to completely move. You can even just add a bit of a neural glide. So if you're sitting in a left leg split, let's say, and it's been about a minute, but you want to hold for 2 minutes, maybe for the next 30 seconds, you bring your chin to your chest and then you look up. So now we're adding that nerve glide, or you point and flex your foot. So now you're adding that nerve glide. So you're still stretching, but you're adding different tension, different emphasis every 30 to 60 seconds rather than just staying in one position. We'll have more examples of how to implement this with different body segments in the upcoming sessions in the following weeks. Something else to be aware of with increasing your available range of motion is what's called reactive guarding. So muscle guarding is a muscle activating because it's trying to protect a joint or it's trying to protect itself. So sometimes you might feel this as a muscle feels really tight or really limited, but what it's doing is it's trying to protect itself. And so the muscle just simply isn't able to relax because it's trying to prevent injury. So if you just keep stretching because it feels really tight or it feels really restricted, it might not actually be tight or restrictive. In this scenario, if you're having this reactive guarding, what you might need to work on more is the strength, stability, and proper motor control, or how your brain is talking to your muscles to allow for a safer movement throughout the available range, to let this muscle be able to safely relax into your stretch to increase that available range of motion. So how do we show flexibility at maximum amplitude? We've now talked about the components of flexibility, but how do you show it? So you have your available passive range of motion, which is what you have, and your accessible or active range of motion, which is what you can show. The connection between available and accessible range of motion, what you have and what you can show, is strength throughout the entire range of motion. So let's look back at this picture again, right? You have the motion you're able to demonstrate during your elements, which is here, but our phase 2 is about improving that accessible range so that it comes closer to equaling your available range and allows you to reach maximum amplitude. So for example, what if your oversplits look like this? Or maybe if you're not trying to balance on balls here, your oversplits are even bigger in that nice, beautiful square position. But then when you go to do a leap, your leap looks like this. And it's not in that maximum amplitude, but you say, well, but I can get there. My split looks like this. It's not always just, oh, try harder, focus more. It's actually learning and understanding how strength and stability will allow your active range of motion, your accessible range of motion, to reach your available or passive range of motion. So rhythmic gymnasts tend to demonstrate a lot of hypermobility, a lot of mobility in your joints. When you have this increased mobility, you need to be able to stabilize the joints, to stabilize with through the range. Without the ability to stabilize, this can lead to injuries, and it'll also lead to inconsistencies in your gymnastics and dance technique. So if sometimes you do a penché spin and you're able to stay up really, really tight and get maybe 4 or more pivots, but sometimes you can barely get to 1. Sometimes this is because you don't have the strength and stability to be able to consistently find that same position every time. Before we can even discuss strengthening and reaching maximum amplitude, you need that solid foundation. So you need to have what we've worked on achieving through those phase 1 interventions. And you need to continue utilizing exercises from phase 1 to maintain and improve on that foundational strength. So you can't put a roof on a house that has no walls. The phase 1 are those walls, it's that foundation. It's harder to build a house on gravel or sand than it is on a solid foundation. So phase 1 is your foundation, and you can't forget about maintaining and continuing to work on that foundation just because you're trying to progress into phase 2. Phase 2 does not happen without phase 1. But working into this strength and stability, we're going to dispel the myth that being strong does not mean adding bulk or limiting flexibility. You can have a beautiful aesthetic appearance and be really flexible and be strong. So you can be strong without limiting the aesthetic appearance. So let's define strength. Strength is defined as the maximum force that can be exerted in a single voluntary contraction. So a lot of people will think Olympic weightlifters. This does not fit what we need in rhythmic gymnastics. We're not doing a 1 repetition maximum power lift, lifting as much as you can one time. What rhythmic gymnasts need is their movements to last for a few seconds because you need to hold a balance. And you also need to be able to transition frequently throughout the entire force continuum. So being able to find the right strength that you need at the right time in the right position and move through these positions frequently throughout your routines. Strength and stability is all about improving the ability to generate force for enhanced performance and decreased risk of injury. Research has shown that you can increase muscle strength without increasing muscle size. So emphasizing it, without increasing your muscle bulk, you can still get stronger. And this happens when strengthening is implemented properly so that it doesn't affect the aesthetics or limit flexibility. But what it does do is improve the amplitude of your elements and decrease risk of injury. The key here is strengthening that is properly implemented. And what that is knowing why you're doing each exercise and being able to identify what exercises are needed for each gymnast. So that myth also of, well, because it worked for someone, it'll work for me, or it'll work for all of my gymnasts because this one gymnast got better by doing this one specific exercise, that's not accurate. We need to understand why we're doing every exercise and what the intention is to be able to strengthen properly for each gymnast. Caroline.
Just want to emphasize for everybody here in the second line that Jenna has on her slide is that they actually did go through research to really try to figure out if this is actually true. Can you increase strength without increasing the actual size? And just echoing what Jenna said is, yes, you can. And her point is, you have to have that strength. You have to have that strength to do the elements that you're trying to do, keep yourself healthy. And so in order to have that strength, you do have to do the phase 1 work. So you can't skip phase 1 because you're afraid that planks are going to build bulk. Because what she's saying, just saying it again, is that you can build your strength without building the muscle size if you do it completely correctly. Is that the right paraphrase?
Yes.
I'm just emphasizing here because this is the direct response to the concern that everybody had. And in order to give you the right answer, that they really have done a lot of research in whatever research is available on this topic, available versus accessible research. So I think this slide is really important because it is addressing at the core one of the main concerns of some of our coaches and athletes, and also a core concern of rhythmic gymnastics, which is to have long and strong muscles. And it is possible, and it all has to do with, exactly as Jenna said, understanding what you're doing and why you're doing it for whatever the objective is. And so that is really going to be at the center of course, this webinar, and then the subsequent 4 webinars on the different body parts if you're trying to extend this or improve this or strengthen this.
Absolutely. So strength throughout the available range allows a gymnast to improve their accessible range. This equals their maximum amplitude. So how do we address strength? How do you get stronger? And the key to this is what's called progressive loading. If you don't increase the challenge, progress will stagnate. This happens the same with gymnastics too, right? So if you keep doing the same element over and over, you'll get really good at that one element, but that's not progressing. You're not increasing your difficulty. You have to keep increasing the challenge to continue progressing. This is the same with strengthening. So some of this are things that we've already covered, right? So there's different ways to load the body. Things like changing the number of repetitions. So instead of doing 1 set of 10, when that gets easy, do 2 sets of 10 or 3 sets of 10. You can also load the body differently by decreasing your rest rates. So maybe do 30 in a row instead of 3 sets of 10 where you take a break after each 10 repetitions. You can progressively load by increasing the arc of movement, so working that strength through a larger range of motion. You can also add resistance bands, or occasionally, but rarely, adding weights. Before adding any type of resistance, you must first have the proper form and technique, including the muscle activation patterns, your body position, and control. If you start adding resistance before a gymnast is comfortable and consistent with the proper technique, the gymnast will compensate to achieve their task. So just like we talked about with stretching, they want to succeed. They want to get from point A to point B, and they'll find a way to get there. But are they using the right muscles? So if you don't have that foundational strength to be able to be consistent and correct with the exercise without resistance, and you add resistance, what's going to happen is a compensation, which can lead to injury, or even if there's not an injury, it'll just lead to the wrong muscles working. So you're not meeting your objective because you're using the wrong muscles. This also then leads to inconsistency of your performance because you're not using the right muscles, and so you can't activate the right muscles at the right time when you need to in your elements. So different interventions are based on the intended outcome, and you need to understand what your objective is and how to choose the best intervention to achieve the intended outcome. So let's break it down a little bit more with resistance bands versus weights. So resistance bands, the tension is the pull of the band. So that's where your increased resistance is coming from. The resistance band is not dependent on gravity. Tension is always present, but the amount of tension changes as the range increases. You're less likely to use momentum because you have to continue stretching the band, and both legs are working. So back to my little rhythmic gymnast stick figures here. So these green squares, that's where your resistance band is connecting to their ankles, and the red dotted line, that's your resistance band. So let's say we're doing forward battements laying on your back. And so you're kicking that leg up. Well, you're using both legs because while this leg has to lift, this leg has to stay on the ground to provide a position for that top leg to reach from. As you increase your range, that tension is increasing until you get to the top of your range and then control it back down. You have tension that whole time. Well, now let's look what happens with using a weight. Weights follow the line of gravity. The line of pull will always be down towards the ground because gravity is always pulling you down. Your supine battements past 90 degrees, past straight vertical, the weight is assisting rather than resisting. So we start here. You have your ankle weight here and the line of gravity pulling straight down. Now we're at 90 degrees and it's pulling straight down in the line of the leg. But what happens when we go past 90 degrees? Now our line of pull is here, gravity still pulling down. So now you have the weight pulling down plus gravity and the weight of your leg all pulling in this direction. And that can be really challenging to control because everything's pulling you here. Also, ideally that bottom leg is down on the ground and staying really strong and tight because you're deliberately working both legs, but it might not be. Maybe that hip is lifting up off the ground or not staying long and strong. Whereas if we look back here, in order to keep that tension, that bottom leg has to be your stable base of support as that resistance band lengthens. So understanding that the line of gravity is what's changing with an ankle weight versus that resistance band. And so those are some of the key differences between using a resistance band versus using a weight.
Jenna?
Yes.
I think you possibly have a question, and I really want everybody in this meeting to use this opportunity to ask questions related to this. So I'll let Beth do that, and gymnasts, everybody should ask questions, but I will ask you based on your depiction right here in the final phase, in the final picture, perhaps the thought process in this last picture is, well, yeah, that's exactly right. All this force is pulling the leg down, so that's how I'm going to get more flexible.
But in this position, you might have some of that reactive guarding where your muscles are tightening to try to protect because they can't control this position, because this isn't the best way to achieve increased range of motion. And we'll go into that a little more in next week's presentation of what are the better ways to increase that available range of motion. But if you're using this for strengthening, you've got to understand that now you have the weight and gravity and your leg all pulling down here. And if you're thinking, well, I'm using that for flexibility, this really isn't the most beneficial way, because you can compensate by hiking and moving through your pelvis, by lifting that bottom leg, and it's really putting a lot of strain through that leg, especially if you're doing it with speed. If you're trying to kick that leg, that's not an effective or a safe way to improve that stretch.
Okay, that's a great clarification for all athletes and coaches to really understand this difference. So please, everybody, use this opportunity to ask any questions you might have about using bands versus using weights. Go ahead, Beth, if you could.
The question is probably for everybody, which is this whole webinar going to be available to the community after the presentation today?
Yeah, we're recording all of the webinars, and our intention is to use absolutely everything here for education.
Okay, thank you.
Other questions about bands? Do you have more slides on? I can't remember if you have more slides on bands versus weights.
Yes. So with
okay, yeah. So keep asking whatever is coming on these topics, and keep going, John. So good.
So resistance bands and weights should never be used for jumping. Never. This adds way too much force and impact on your joints and is likely to cause injury. Then it also goes back to knowing your objectives. So for example, the focus of the CLX ballet band interval training was to improve the strength and stability of your stance leg and your gesture leg for improved ability to pull up and stand tall on your stance leg during elements. This was not intended to replace ballet. Although there's similar movement patterns that we used in the CLX ballet exercises, adding resistance is using that principle of progressive loading to improve your strength and stability. But you still need that ballet technique to work on the consistency of movements. You need to demonstrate proper ballet technique before you can even consider adding a resistance band using those CLX ballet exercises. Another example that we've had some questions on from athletes and coaches is the use of lunges. So a lot of times you'll look at a lunge and think of, oh, a track athlete, sprinters using lunges, working on their power, building these big bulky muscles by doing lunges, and limiting their ability to develop these long, beautiful muscles that we're looking for in rhythmic gymnastics. But really, a lunge is just a plie in a different position. You're in a long stride stance and working on a plie. So in knowing the objective of it, so when a rhythmic gymnast is doing a stride stance plie or a lunge, you're actually elongating your hip flexors and quads of your back leg, creating an active stretch, an active lengthening of that back leg. You're emphasizing that circular movement of a plie that Christina talks about, that's talked about in the video that Caroline sent out, and you're working that circular movement to resist gravity lifting up as you lower down and then pressing into a return to standing position while you're lengthening, lifting up out of your pelvis. Knowing the intention of the exercises and the cues or the thought process, what you should be thinking about while you're doing the exercises, will actually allow you to use this as a way to elongate rather than adding bulk. We're never going to add weights. You're not going to do a weighted lunge where you're holding a barbell here or holding weights in your hands. That's something that a track athlete might do per se, but as rhythmic gymnasts, you're not going to do it that way. But we can utilize lunges in some of these different movement patterns that aren't traditionally thought to be part of rhythmic gymnastics training to improve strength and length. Caroline.
So to paraphrase that, would it be helpful for athletes and coaches to think of these lunges that our rhythmic programming has integrated as different positions for plie, which is the foundation of every movement we do?
Absolutely.
And so the way that the lunge would create bulk, or let's say the different forms of plie would create bulk, is only, being performed with holding heavy weights.
That's definitely one way. So by holding weights, you can add bulk. By not working through your full range of motion, by limiting the range that you're working through, that can also add bulk. And we'll talk about that a little bit later as well. But strengthening through the range of motion is what allows for long, strong muscles.
Especially, I think, as you said, which was really important, entering that plie or lunging position and pulling up, which is at the core of sort of technique, it is really crucial. And then just to clarify again, and we'll move into the questions, something that you said here, the CLX ballet band series, that has a different objective than ballet without CLX bands.
Yes.
Yes, and just want to be clear for everybody, it's not one or the other, they have different objectives. So doing ballet is working on your foundational technique, the pathway, plie, releve, jumping, and the CLX band interval training. Can you clarify for them what the difference is between the two?
So it's using that foundational movement patterns and building strength with them as well. So we're doing that progressive loading. We're adding more challenge, more difficulty to it so that you get even stronger.
But why wouldn't, maybe somebody could think, well, I just would save time if I just do the latter.
Because if you don't continue to return to your basics and return to your foundations, your foundation gets shaky, right? You have to have the basics. And because your ballet is part of your warm-up, it's part of your preparation to prepare your body to be ready to perform at your maximum amplitude.
Okay, thanks. Okay, Beth.
Okay, for Jenna, there are several questions about the weights and bands, and they're all good ones. First one is, what is the best way to increase the challenge with the band? Is it better to give more resistance, or would you change the exercises?
With that, it absolutely depends on the exercise and on the gymnast. So kind of the joke in physical therapy is the answer is always it depends, right? And so you need to know what your objective is. So is it that the exercise, it depends on where you're at in the resistance as well. So with certain exercises, like let's say some of your basic just ankle TheraBand exercises, those are good to do. And so you might just want to increase your resistance with it. But with some of other exercises, it might be important to mix it up a little bit and change into different exercises. So if you're using, let's say, a yellow TheraBand for an exercise, that's pretty easy. So you can build up to a certain point into your green or into your blue bands. And then when that starts getting easy, picking new exercises to still address the same strengthening positions that you're looking for, but in a different way.
Okay, and then the next one, also a great one, is about doing kicks. So the question is, can you do kicks standing with using the weights? And how is that different than lying on your back?
Okay, so I'm gonna go back to here. And so the difference is when you're doing a kick, so that line of gravity, so if we say now that this is the floor over here, so we're kind of turning the slide on its slide and they're standing, that line is now going to go down. So then we have to get a little bit into what are called lever arms, or the distance between the weight and the axis of movement through the hip. But what happens is that line is still coming straight down, and you're now having to really have that strength and stability through that bottom leg. Like we talked about, it needs, even when you're laying on your back, that bottom leg needs to be strong and holding that position. Well, now when you're standing, it needs to support your entire body weight and the weight of the force of that weight moving in that long arc all the way up to your maximum here. And so that can put a lot of strain through the bottom leg, through your back, through your leg. And sometimes a gymnast might be strong enough that they can actually do that. But when you're adding the speed of a kick and the control that's needed in that bottom, in that powerful, fast movement, a lot of times weights are not indicated because it can increase risk of injury. And there's better ways of strengthening that we'll be talking about in more specifics next week. on better ways to address that in a safer way. And Beth, please add on if you have anything else with that.
Yeah, but there will be, like anything, some exceptions to this. There will be some kids or some of your athletes that have excellent form that could do the kick with light ankle weights, and we're talking 1 to 2 pounds in standing. But that would be the exception, not the norm. And they have to have excellent form before you would add the ankle weight. So form is crucial.
But Beth, what would be the, why would that be, what would be the goal of that actually?
Actually, it would improve their front leg strength and power. For example, kicking through a straight leg for a split leap.
Okay.
So there is a skill correlation.
But when would somebody know that that's the better pathway for them versus not? Or, I mean, that's something actually, we're kind of going into this, I think, next week in this particular grouping. But I mean, can you give maybe a more general statement on, like you said, once, if their form is ideal, and what other criteria would need to be met before somebody would consider doing that?
That's a good question. I'm not sure I have like a scientific based answer, but I would say they would have to have excellent form. They have to have a goal of what they're trying to do the skill for. Like if the goal is to have a better front leg kick in a split leap, then that would be appropriate.
And what about, I mean, would you suggest, well, before you get to the weight, you start with the band?
Jenna, do you have a, I think we're splitting hairs a little bit with this, but.
Just to understand kind of what's the idea?
I think typically I would recommend resistance bands before weights with that, because since you have that increased resistance through the range, it's going to give the muscles a little bit more feedback on how and when to kick in, versus a weight can sometimes be a little bit more challenging, but not in the like progressive loading, more of a, it leaves more room for compensations.
Yeah.
Do you agree with that?
Yeah, that's sounds good. And just the last question is, what can bands or weights be used in phase 1? And yes, they absolutely can. From my point of view, Jenna, you're nodding, you agree?
Yes.
Okay. Thank you everyone for all your questions.
Thank you. Okay. So one of the other components that I want you to understand as part of phase 2 is what's called motor control, or the brain-body connection. So we've talked a lot about nerves with neural glides, with neural tension, with body waves, but how about how your nerves talk to your muscles? That brain-body connection. That your nervous system also improves as you get stronger. So this is kind of stepping into that phase 2 understanding, taking what you've learned in phase 1 and applying it to that more detailed understanding. So motor control is defined as the long-term learned skill of effective muscle recruitment. So when you're first learning a skill or working on strength through a new range, it's going to be difficult. But the more you work at it correctly with proper muscle activation patterns, the easier it gets. This is not only because you're stronger, but also because your body has found a more efficient way to complete the movement pattern. Initially, when you're learning something new or working into a new range, you have high levels of recruitment of a few motor units. But we're working towards more efficient muscle activation at less perceptible levels. So I like to explain this as lifting a gallon of milk. So probably everyone on this call has taken a gallon of milk or a picture of something out of the fridge. And so when you're doing that, if you see that it's a full gallon of milk, because you've lifted that before, because you know your body knows approximately how much that weighs, you know how much effort to use in lifting it. If it's almost empty, again, your brain has a good idea of how much muscle recruitment to tell your body to lift. But what if you go to lift that gallon of milk and you think that it's empty, but it's actually full? So now you go at it and you don't have a whole lot of muscle recruitment because you think it's pretty much empty, but now it's full and you can't quite lift it as fluidly, as smoothly as you could when you knew, or the opposite, that you think that it's full, but it's actually empty and your arm goes flying because you've used too much. So this motor control is knowing how much effort, how much strength to put in to doing that movement pattern. And that comes with time and continued training. That your brain-body connection, that nervous system gets stronger, knows the patterns better as you keep getting stronger as well. Let's step now into local versus global muscle systems.
Sorry, Jenna, there's one question left on bands and weights. The question, or Beth, go ahead, you got it?
I got it.
Okay.
All right. Weights increasing body instability during, okay, so gymnasts using upper body to work with weights. Is that okay?
I mean, I think she's actually, sorry, Beth, I think she's saying, like, she's trying to make sure she's understood it correctly. So, like, using weights increases the amount of body instability. And so what they end up doing is using their upper body when they work with weights. Is the coach understanding it correctly? I right? Or can this coach can, yes, the coach said yes, that's the correct question.
Okay, maybe can you paraphrase that again? I'm not sure I understand.
So I think the question is, this coach is trying to make sure she's understood correctly, that one of the, and this, again, this coach can help me understand, but this question, one of the reasons why using weights is maybe less effective is because the body, she's a gymnast you're compensating, right? The gymnast is using the upper body to work with weights. So it becomes
you have a weight on your ankle that you're maybe guarding or lifting up too much through your upper body.
Yes, I think
maybe.
Is that the question? Or globally, what you seem to have been saying is that by using the weights, yes, compensation. By using the weights, and that's how I've understood what you're presenting too. So maybe you can help us be sure. The drawback to using weights, which are commonly used in this country in rhythmic gymnastics and perhaps across the world, but the drawback for people to understand is that it opens up the opportunity for a lot of compensation
if not implemented at the right time with the right gymnast. So those compensations can be seen even without weights, but before you can add weights, you have to make sure that that movement pattern is consistent, with control, with understanding what's happening. And if you add weights and you see those compensations, you need to back off and find a different way of increasing the progressive load rather than adding weights, because we don't want to reinforce those compensation patterns.
Right, and maybe you can just clarify one more time. What is the outcome of a gymnast developing all these compensations?
It can absolutely lead to injury, both now or along the line in the future, but it also leads to inconsistent performance because you're using the wrong muscles at the wrong time. And so you're not going to be consistent in your ability to perform your elements.
So ultimately, you're not really going to achieve your goals of showing maximum amplitude.
Absolutely.
Okay, so hopefully that answered that question, but keep the questions coming, and it's okay if we have to clarify 100 times, because we really want people through this information to feel like they have a solid understanding so they can adjust the way that they're training.
Thank you for all the questions. Okay. Local versus global muscle systems. So muscles have different responsibilities, but they need to work together for efficient and elegant movement patterns. So your local muscle systems, or we can call them your stabilizer muscles, they include things like your deep core stabilizers. We've talked a lot in the past about your transverse abdominis, your TA. So this muscle attaches from the spine, wraps around, almost acting like a corset around the low back, and gives that really great foundational strength for your core. These stabilizer muscles, they surround the structures that they're trying to support. They're the foundation of all movement. So they are that solid foundation that you're building on. But they also work at what's called a submaximal activation. So they don't fatigue very fast, and they also don't contract very fast. It's a slow speed of contraction. You don't always feel these muscles working. So a lot of times when we would say, okay, belly button to spine, use that TA, you're not going to feel the muscle burn like you do with other exercises because they're these stabilizer muscles. And ideally, it should be subconscious. So during phase 1, we've talked a lot about belly button to spine, using that TA. And when you're doing your exercises, you should absolutely be aware of it. But when you're doing your elements and when you're doing your routines and your choreography, I don't want you to have to think about, oh, pull my belly button to my spine, use my TA, because it should be there. It should know to work because you've worked it, because you've trained it, because you've built that foundational strength. So when you're doing your routines, you're not focused on what muscles need to contract at what time. You might be thinking about it in general terms like pull up or don't sink into my pelvis, but you're not specifically thinking of certain muscles at certain times. Now, on kind of the other side of the coin, of the local muscle systems or the stabilizers, are your global muscle systems or your mover muscles. These are more superficial, meaning they're closer to the skin. And some examples are your obliques, so those muscles along the sides of your core, your rectus abdominis, that's your six-pack muscle, your lats, which we've talked about are kind of on your back and connect from your shoulder to your shoulder blade to your lumbar spine into your pelvis. But your mover muscles, these global muscle systems, are responsible for movement and directional control. Your local and global muscles must work together. So let's talk about a penché position here. So what are some of your local or stabilizer muscles that are working when you're in this penché position? Muscles like your TA, your transverse abdominis, your multifidus, your scapular stabilizer, so those muscles around your shoulder blades, your rotator cuff, which is the group of 4 muscles that in your shoulder joint keep that ball centered in the socket, your deep hip rotators, your deep cervical flexors, which keep your neck in that good position so your chin isn't jutting forward or you're keeping your head up or dropping down. Those are those stabilizer muscles that are helping you hold that beautiful penché position. Whereas your global muscles or your mover muscles include your glutes, your hamstrings, your spine extensors, the muscles along your back here that are helping you to hold up so that gravity isn't just pulling you down, your deltoids, those muscles in your shoulders that are helping your arms come up overhead in this position. Everything must work together. If they're not working together, or if you lack that foundational strength of those stabilizer muscles, those local muscles, your shoulders will shrug up, you'll hike your hip, you'll sink into your bottom hip, your head might be in a bad position. And what that causes is your position, it's not efficient, you don't have good form, and you're at risk of injury. So your local and global muscles must work together. Phase 1, a lot of what we focused on was how to activate the muscles in the right order. You need to be able to continue working on this to maintain control. These are good to do as part of your warm-up or maybe as part of your conditioning after practice. But the goal is to allow for these muscles to activate subconsciously where you don't have to think about it. But just because it's subconscious doesn't mean it isn't deliberate. Just because you aren't specifically focusing on telling certain muscles to activate doesn't mean you're just letting your body go wherever it'll go. You're still thinking about it, just maybe in more general terms of pull up and things like that. The goal is smooth, easy movement with minimal effort. This takes time and deliberate training. If you lack the strength of your stability or local muscles, then you'll be trying to use your global or mover muscles to do both jobs for moving and stability. And that's not effective. First off, because it causes things like your shoulders to come up because you're not able to stabilize through your core and through those scapular stabilizers that are holding your shoulder blades in a good position. So maybe you're shrugging up, but it also can lead to overuse injuries because you're trying to use those global or mover muscles to do double duty. They're trying to do more than just what they're meant to do. So you need that foundational strength of those local or stability muscles. so that you're avoiding injury and so that it looks better. You're not, so that you can have a smooth, fluid movement and reach your maximum amplitude. Now, what I don't expect is for you to know the names of all of these muscles. I just want you to recognize that there's different jobs that the muscles do, that some are more for providing stability and some are more for that movement, and that they each need to do their own job, but work together to allow you to achieve your maximum amplitude. Okay, so strengthening through the full range of motion. This allows for the development of long, strong muscles. Okay, so if you think of a cyclist who's riding a bike, working in this limited range, when they're on their bike, they're only strengthening in this limited range, where their knees don't even extend all the way straight here. They don't bend all the way. They're in this very limited range as they're riding a bike. And this can cause a shortening of the muscles, which can increase muscle bulk and limit flexibility. But in rhythmic gymnastics, we're going to strengthen through the full range of motion. So you've worked already on building a strong foundation of strength to initiate movement, to know how to stay stable through your core, how to lift through these beginning ranges of movement into the mid-range. But now we need to continue strengthening throughout your range so that your accessible range of motion is closer to your available range of motion. And we'll be talking about that more specifically. This is, again, just a general overview to give you the background terminology. The upcoming weeks will show you a little bit more how to get there. But the key is strengthen what you stretch and stretch what you strengthen. That you have to work both to be able to achieve your maximum amplitude. And we'll be discussing this more specifically in the upcoming weeks. But stretch what you strengthen and strengthen what you stretch. All of that is the key to working together. One of those other myths that were mentioned at the beginning, that I mentioned at the beginning of the presentation, is that flexibility can only be built while you're really young. But what I want you to understand is that flexibility and strength vary throughout your life. That as a younger gymnast, you might have a great available range of motion. Your oversplits and your back flexibility come really easy to you. And that's a great time to work on your strength and stability throughout your range to improve the movement patterns with proper sequencing, the right muscle activation pattern. This is the time to work on the strength and stability throughout that range to improve your accessible range with proper sequencing to allow for increased consistency of performance and decreased injury risk. You also do want to continue working on that flexibility to keep improving your available range, that passive range of motion, but making sure that you're ensuring symmetry and encouraging proper alignment from a very young age. Sometimes when you hit a growth spurt and your bones lengthen faster than your muscles do, and some of you might have hit a bit of a growth spurt during this time of home training, and now you're maybe not feeling quite as flexible because your bones lengthened faster than your muscles, connective tissues, and nerves have lengthened. So now maybe you have a decreased available range. This is the time to continue working on improving your available range with safe stretching. But it's also important to work on strength throughout your range of motion to keep your accessible range of motion as close to your available range of motion as possible so that you're continuing to work on reaching your maximum amplitude. Flexibility throughout your life is a fluid process. It continuously involves both strengthening and working flexibility deliberately. And by utilizing the research-based approaches that we've talked about and will continue talking about to improve your maximum amplitude, it'll improve your performance capabilities as well. The goal is always to keep gymnasts healthy, both to decrease their injury risk, but also to continue to find joy in the sport and decrease burnout. Sometimes it can be really frustrating if, let's say, you're maybe a younger gymnast, you have a lot of flexibility, but you lack consistency and you can't figure out why. Well, we need to work on the strength so that you can find that consistency of movement pattern to know that when you do this specific element, the right muscles are working in the right amount at the right time. Or after that growth spurt where now you're just maybe not quite as flexible for the time being. You want them to understand that this is just a phase and it's a fluid process that you'll work through together to continue improving their available and accessible range of motion so that they keep finding joy in the sport and keep enjoying what they're doing. So kind of the key points of the progression of phase 1 and 2 is that you cannot skip, discontinue, or forget about what you learned during phase 1. Phase 2, without the foundations of phase 1, is trying to put a roof on a house with no walls. It just doesn't work. You have to keep focused on parts of phase 1 as you build into phase 2. Hopefully today you learned a little bit better understanding of the anatomy and physiology of flexibility and strength. And this is something that I think will be a little bit more understandable as we keep applying it to the body in the upcoming sessions. Being able to define the difference between available passive range of motion and accessible or active range of motion. Recognizing that strength throughout the available range allows a gymnast to improve their accessible range, thereby reaching their maximum amplitude. And that proper implementation of phase 1 and phase 2 will allow for reaching maximum amplitude with decreased risk of injury and improved consistency of performance. Okay, that was a lot of information that we went through today. And you might be feeling like this at the end of your active recovery and just kind of laying down on the ground and taking it all in. But the detailed presentation today and trying to help you understand the anatomy and physiology of flexibility and strength, you need to understand this to be able to understand how to reach maximum amplitude. And the upcoming presentations will provide more specifics, but in order to understand that, you need to know the basics that we covered today. And so looking forward to what's next. In the upcoming sessions, we'll address those specific body part segments, including hamstrings and hip flexors, improving flexibility and strength. That'll be next week, followed by releve, turnout, and strength and flexibility of back and shoulders. During these, we'll keep discussing how to safely improve their passive range of motion, their available range of motion, and working towards increasing your accessible or active range of motion. And both of these together will allow you to reach your maximum amplitude. And then just some references.
Jenna, this is completely amazing and super exciting. I want to point out, and perhaps you can confirm, if we just take the national team, our whole national team is probably, everyone is at a different part of phase 1 versus phase 2. And that's not even our point. And same with gymnasts across the entire country. So I would assume that we have gymnasts who need to keep sort of focusing on certain aspects of phase 1, right? Before kind of moving on. We have people that are strong to the core and are ready for next level challenges. So part of what the next 4 weeks are going to involve are reminders and guidance checks. Sorry for my dog barking in the background. Of how to almost self-assess where you are and where you want to go. Is that accurate?
Yes, definitely. So you need to, and we've talked about it as we're teaching exercises in camps, via Zoom, all of it, that the quality of movement and making sure that you're doing it correctly is more important than where you're at. So you can't just keep skipping ahead, and you need to recognize where you're at and take it step by step to be able to reach your maximum. If you try to skip ahead, you're not going to get there.
So you just have a couple comments from some of the coaches out there. Thank you for the amazing presentation as usual. Thanks for the hard work. And it's a good education team. And also another comment, thanks for the great work and a Nobel Prize for Jenna.
Well, thank you all for sticking with me. I know some of this was a lot of detail into the anatomy, but I think it'll provide a good basis for moving forward to help you understand the terminology that we're going to use and some of those factors that play into reaching your maximum amplitude.
Yeah, thank you all, actually, everybody for joining. And I noticed, because of my limited screen size, that actually the number of people that had raised their hands of having looked at that article and looked at that video that I sent was a much smaller number than originally appeared on my screen. So if it would be possible, I would really like to encourage you all to read that. It might even make more sense now that we've gone through this presentation, or reread it. It's a great reinforcer. And Nobel Prize is an understatement. This is, as Jenna said, there isn't that much research on some of these topics, and yet these ladies are all working on it, and people that aren't even on the screen too are contributing as well. And so thank you to all of them. Thank you for all of you for sitting. I hope you feel a sense of being energized by how incredibly useful this information is. And I'm just ready for hamstrings and hip flexors. So thank you all. Now, if there's any more questions, it would be absolutely great if you could, another thank you came through, but are there any other questions? All right.
And feel free, if you have any questions when you're thinking about this, feel free to reach out, email, call me, anything like that, and we can absolutely address that.
Here we go. This is so great. Thank you so much, Jenna. Thank you, Beth. Thank you to all of the people that contributed to this, and will continue to contribute to the next 4 weeks, which, by the time we get through this, we're going to be just so ready to fulfill our own personal max. It's so exciting. This is so great. Thank you all. And thank you, Shelby at USA Gymnastics, for all these webinars. You're not on the screen, but man, you're amazing.
You're welcome.
All right. Thank you, everybody. Have a super great weekend, and see you next week.
Thank you, everyone.
You have a-
Bye.